January 30th, 1649. King Charles I kneels at the execution block in London. "I go from a corruptible to an incorruptible crown," he declares moments before the axe falls. With a single stroke, the unthinkable happens. A king executed by his own people. The crowd releases a collective groan that seems to shake the very foundations of England. But Charles's execution was only the beginning. This is the story of the king who lost his head, the men who took it, and how the most public execution in English history unleashed a bloodbath that would consume its own architects. And you wouldn't believe what happened to the head of the man who orchestrated it all. Displayed on a spike, blown down in a storm, hidden in a chimney, and paraded through drawing rooms for the next 3 centuries. But first, to understand why a king lost his head, we must first understand the man who wore the crown. Charles I ascended to the English throne in 1625, inheriting not just a kingdom, but a worldview. Standing only 5 feet 4 inches tall with a pronounced stammer, Charles compensated for his physical limitations with absolute certainty in the divine right of kings, the idea that monarchs were appointed by God and accountable only to him, not to their subjects, or even to the laws of the realm. But England had outgrown such medieval certainties. Parliament had tasted power and wanted more. Wealthy merchants demanded accountability for their tax money, and religious tensions simmered between Anglicans, Puritans, and Catholics, further inflamed when Charles married a Catholic French princess. The king responded to challenges with escalating autocracy. He dissolved Parliament when it questioned him, imposed taxes without approval, arrested critics, and enforced religious conformity across 3 reluctant kingdoms. The breaking point came in 1642, when Charles stormed into Parliament with armed men to arrest 5 members who had opposed him. They had been warned and escaped, leaving Charles to remark awkwardly, "I see the birds have flown." With them, the king's last shreds of authority had vanished too. Civil war erupted. For 6 bloody years, England tore itself apart. Parliament's disciplined new model army, forged in battle and led by the brilliant Oliver Cromwell, eventually crushed the royalist forces. Charles surrendered in 1646 to the Scottish army, who later handed him over to Parliament for a hefty sum of £400,000. Parliament might have restored Charles to a limited throne, but the king couldn't abandon his belief in absolute monarchy. While negotiations dragged on, he secretly encouraged a Scottish invasion and fresh rebellions, plunging exhausted England back into a second civil war in 1648. Cromwell and his forces crushed these uprisings with ruthless efficiency, and the army's patience with the duplicitous king finally snapped. In December 1648, Colonel Thomas Pride purged Parliament of members still willing to negotiate with Charles, leaving only the most hardline opponents of monarchy. A rump parliament that would do the army's bidding. The king was placed under strict guard at Windsor Castle, while revolutionaries debated his fate. "We will cut off his head with the crown on it," Cromwell reportedly declared, convinced Charles was a man of blood who would never accept limits on his power. But how do you legally execute someone who embodies the law itself? There was, of course, no precedent for trying a king. Parliament would have to invent justice, and in doing so, redefine the very relationship between ruler and ruled. Before we continue with the extraordinary details of the king's final moments, I'd like to ask for your support. If you're finding this historical journey valuable, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps ensure we can continue bringing these historical moments to light. Thanks to all who do. January 30th, 1649 dawned bitterly cold in London. The Thames had frozen over during one of the harshest winters in memory, an appropriate backdrop for the unprecedented chill about to sweep through English political life. Westminster Hall falls silent as the unthinkable unfolds. A reigning monarch forced to stand trial before his subjects. King Charles soon enters to face a court unlike any in English history. The vast medieval space, witness to coronation feasts and state trials for centuries, now hosts the most revolutionary legal proceeding in Europe. Charles is seated in a crimson velvet chair, deliberately positioned lower than Lord President John Bradshaw. The message is clear. Today, the king is not above his people, but beneath them. "I would know by what power I am called hither," Charles demands repeatedly, refusing to remove his hat in deference to the court. "By what lawful authority am I brought before you?" Bradshaw gave a response that cut to the heart of the revolution. "The authority of the people of England, by whom you were elected king." This exchange wasn't merely legal posturing. It was the collision of two irreconcilable worldviews. Charles believed kings were appointed by God. His judges claimed power flowed from the people. Both couldn't be right. For 3 tense days, this philosophical battle played out as political theatre. Charles, despite his stammer, found eloquence in crisis. He refused to plead, knowing that doing so would acknowledge the court's legitimacy. Instead, he transformed from defendant to prosecutor, challenging the very foundation of the proceedings. But the outcome was predetermined. On January 27th, the court pronounced its sentence. Charles Stuart, as a tyrant, traitor, murderer, and public enemy, would die by beheading. In a final, powerful speech, Charles offered a warning that would prove prophetic. "If power without law may make laws, I do not know what subject in England can be sure of his life or anything he calls his own." The king, who had so often trampled Parliament's rights, now positioned himself as liberty's last defender against arbitrary power. In truth, both sides claimed to protect England from tyranny. Charles from the tyranny of the mob, his judges from the tyranny of kings. 3 days later, the executioner's axe would settle the argument, at least temporarily. But the king's final moments would prove even more extraordinary than his controversial life. On execution day, King Charles awoke early at St. James's Palace, where he had spent his final night in prayer with Bishop William Juxon. Outside, the bitter cold had intensified. Icicles hung from eaves, and the ground was frozen hard as iron. His preparation was methodical and dignified. Charles requested 2 shirts to wear under his clothing, not out of vanity, but practical concern. He feared that if he shivered in the January cold, spectators might mistake it for fear. Around 10 a.m., Charles was moved to Whitehall Palace, escorted by soldiers. There he spent his final hours in prayer, refusing lunch with the simple statement, "I will eat no more until I eat bread in the kingdom of heaven." Outside, carpenters had been working since dawn to construct the scaffold. It was draped in black cloth and positioned outside the banqueting house, deliberately placed at the level of its first-floor windows. These windows led to a room filled with ceiling paintings by Peter Paul Rubens, glorifying the divine authority of monarchy, commissioned by Charles's father, James I. The symbolism was impossible to miss. By early afternoon, thousands had gathered in the street. Their collective breath rose in a cloud above the crowd, and the scent of wood smoke, sweat, and anticipation mingled in the air. Guards surrounded the scaffold, holding back the crowd, which pressed forward, eager to witness history. Among them were supporters and opponents of the king, common Londoners drawn by spectacle, and foreign dignitaries stunned by what was about to transpire. Shortly after 2 p.m., King Charles I stepped through the window onto the scaffold, calm and collected. He wore a black suit, covered by a cloak, with the Order of the Garter's blue ribbon across his chest. Full royal regalia to the end. Charles was not permitted to address the crowd directly. Instead, he spoke to those few allowed on the scaffold with him, knowing his words would be recorded for posterity. "I go from a temporal to an eternal crown," he declared, maintaining to the end that his cause was just. "I am the martyr of the people." Then came a moment that would be debated by historians for centuries. Charles appeared to engage in a brief, intense conversation with his executioner, a man whose identity was concealed behind a mask and wig. The executioner knelt, asking forgiveness for what he was about to do. "I forgive you with all my heart," replied the king. Then, with odd practicality, he advised the executioner that the block seemed too low. After giving his final instructions, Charles removed his cloak and handed his decorations to Bishop Juxon with the single word, "Remember." He then laid his head on the block, stretched out his hands as a signal when he was ready, and prayed briefly. The axe fell once, cleanly, precisely. The head of Charles I was severed from his body in a single stroke. As the executioner lifted the head to show the crowd, the traditional proof that justice had been done, a groan erupted from the spectators. Instead of the customary declaration, "Behold the head of a traitor," the executioner remained silent. Even in this final moment, no one dared to call the king a traitor aloud. Blood spilled onto the black-draped scaffold. Soldiers held back the crowd. some of whom surged forward with handkerchiefs to dip in the royal blood, believed by many to have healing properties. The king's body was quickly placed in a coffin and removed. That evening, Charles was buried quietly in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. His coffin was lowered into the vault that already held Henry VIII and Jane Seymour, with no elaborate ceremony to mark the passing of a king. But while his body was laid to rest, the consequences of his execution were just beginning to unfold across England, and they would prove to be as bloody as the scaffold at Whitehall. For 11 years after Charles's execution, England existed without a king. Oliver Cromwell ruled as Lord Protector, establishing a republic that quickly began to resemble the monarchy it had replaced, complete with its own court, foreign alliances, and dynastic aspirations. But when Cromwell died in 1658, this republican experiment collapsed. By 1660, England had invited Charles I's son to return from exile and take the throne as Charles II. The new king's first priority wasn't healing, it was vengeance. Charles II drew up a list of the 59 men who had signed his father's death warrant, the regicides. Some had died, others fled to America and the Netherlands, but those who remained faced a reckoning of calculated brutality. On October 13, 1660, the first regicides were executed at Charing Cross, deliberately within sight of where Charles I had died. Major General Thomas Harrison was the first to suffer. His punishment: hanging, drawing, and quartering, the law's most excruciating death. The sickly sweet smell of blood and burning entrails filled the air as crowds watched in both horror and fascination. Even in this agony, Harrison reportedly raised his head and struck his executioner. One witness wrote that he looked as cheerful as any man could in that condition. 9 more regicides followed, each execution attended by thousands. John Cook, the lawyer who had prosecuted Charles I, was dragged on a hurdle through streets where some spectators threw refuse while others wept. The severed heads of these men were displayed on spikes at London's gates, hollow-eyed warnings against challenging royal power. Some remained there for decades, their features gradually eroded by weather and birds. But the most extraordinary vengeance was reserved for the man most responsible for Charles I's death, a man already 3 years in his grave, Oliver Cromwell himself. Oliver Cromwell, the military genius who had defeated Charles I and later ruled England as Lord Protector, had died peacefully in his bed on September 3, 1658, nearly 2 years before the restoration of the monarchy. He had been given a magnificent state funeral and buried in Westminster Abbey. But Charles II was not deterred by the small matter of Cromwell's death. In an unprecedented act of posthumous retribution, Parliament ordered that Cromwell's body be exhumed, along with those of 2 other prominent Republicans, Henry Ireton, Cromwell's son-in-law, and John Bradshaw, who had presided over Charles I's trial. On January 30, 1661, the 12th anniversary of Charles I's execution, the 3 corpses were dragged from Westminster Abbey to Tyburn, the traditional execution site for common criminals. There, the decomposing bodies were hanged in their shrouds from the gallows until evening. Then, still hanging, the bodies were beheaded. The corpses were thrown into a pit beneath the gallows, while the heads were placed on spikes above Westminster Hall, the very location where Charles I had been tried. Almost unbelievably, Cromwell's head remained there for over 20 years, weathering storms and witnessed by generations of Londoners, before finally blowing down in a gale around 1684. But its journey was far from over. The head was allegedly collected by a soldier who hid it in his chimney. Over the following centuries, Cromwell's skull passed through the hands of various collectors and museum owners, becoming a macabre curiosity. It was displayed in private collections, used to entertain guests at dinner parties, and even exhibited for paying customers. For 300 years, the head believed to be Cromwell's continued this strange afterlife. Scientific tests in the early 20th century confirmed its likely authenticity. It showed signs of embalming consistent with Cromwell's funeral preparations, and had a posthumously driven spike hole through the back of the neck. Finally, in 1960, more than 300 years after Cromwell's death, his head met its final resting place in the grounds of Sidney Sussex College, Cambridge, where he had studied as a young man. The burial was conducted in secret, with no marker to identify the spot, a final attempt to give peace to remains that had known none for centuries. This extraordinary treatment of Cromwell's remains reveals the depth of royalist anger. It wasn't enough to reverse Cromwell's policies or dismantle his government. His very corpse had to be humiliated. His physical remains denied peace even in death. Even today, Cromwell's legacy remains contested. His statue stands outside the Houses of Parliament, yet he is remembered by many as a dictator who banned Christmas celebrations and massacred thousands in Ireland. In the complex calculus of historical judgment, both Charles I and the man who ordered his execution remain figures of profound ambiguity. Charles I's execution permanently transformed monarchy in England. The divine right of kings died with him on that scaffold. When his son Charles II returned to the throne, he understood what his father never grasped. His power now depended on Parliament's consent. This revolutionary act rippled through history in three profound ways. First, it revealed that no authority, not even one claimed from God, was beyond challenge. Second, it demonstrated both the power and danger of revolutionary justice. The execution ended one form of tyranny, but unleashed new violence. Third, it forced a fundamental reconsideration of political authority itself. Where does legitimate power come from? What are its limits? These questions would inspire philosophers like Hobbes and Locke, eventually fueling revolutions in America and France. Today, buses and taxis pass the execution site on an ordinary London street. Few notice the plaque marking where a king's death changed the relationship between rulers and the ruled forever. But the principle established that cold January day, that those in power can and should be held accountable, remains at the heart of modern democracy. What do you think? Was Charles I's execution justice for a tyrant or the murder of God's anointed? And if you were there in 1649, which side would you have chosen? Let us know in the comments below. Thank you for watching Nefarious History. If you found this exploration of one of history's most pivotal royal executions fascinating, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Each week, we delve into the forgotten stories and pivotal moments that shaped our world, and we'd love to have you there.